Holy shit, North America is cooking. That ain't bad. I really like the way FlyQuest actually embraced the NA monkey business and they kind of just owned it up to themselves. I heard from Cadriel himself that this team doesn't really care about what the best regions in the world kind of do, right? They didn't scrim any Korean teams at all. They're just like, well, we're clowns and this is our circus, so let's just embrace it, right? And they just basically brought the drafts down from Hanwha down to their level and then beat them with experience, right? So the whole point of these drafts is to give them some curveballs, eh? So Fly basically had a game plan as to let's give them some really off angle picks and try to cheese them. This is LCK number one. If we're gonna try to match Koreans the way Koreans like to play, it's not gonna work, right? Because they just do it their style better. So they just chose to embrace their own style, and this is a little bit set up from the draft here. FlyQuest, I'm starting on red here. They don't necessarily do anything too special, with the exception of the Ash ban. The reason this is important is because this technically opens up the Kalista 1. They do trade the Yone for 1 on this, but it's one of the most common sort of B1 takes that basically every team is going to do. And instead of trying to prevent that from Fly instead actually tried to come up with their own very unique solution into this, which is the Cassio matchup. And although Fly does lose this game, I will tell you that it was actually a very smart idea overall, and they had a very solid plan because of the matchup being so strong into the Yone, actually, and at least in the early game, right? Hanwha, they end up going with a very solid, well-rounded top mid jungle combo to start, and this is where the other interesting part of the draft sort of unveils, because FlyQuest also opt for a mismatch in terms of roles. So a lot of teams are going to choose to match their roles, and it's kind of intuitive to do so based on attempting to gain counter picks, things of that nature, stylistically trying to hold as much of your cards as possible. But FlyQuest have not opted to do this. They just take the Kalista on 1-2 along with the Cassio, and they actually round out with Amumu on 3. So the logic with the Amumu, just for those at home, basically is that it's a similar vein to, let's say, Levi matching Shyvana into the Sedge and also doing the Lilia. Other teams will do Nocturne. It's basically challenging the Sejuani and punishing her if she makes any mistakes, right? And Amumu is basically another version of this, who gets an insane cash out if he so happens to get away scot-free in the early game, right? And it's very ambitious drafting from Fly, and I really like it. It's actually really interesting and very different. And this forces Hanwha, the premier team at being able to dominate teams when they're familiar. It just forced them to be unfamiliar and then see what happens, right? I really like this. Arguably, you could say that they revealed this a little bit early. You could say they could pick Amumu jungle on 4, and then they can go top matchup, cream of the crop on 3, and then basically make the Amumu more of a surprise factor. It doesn't change a significant amount, but it does leave the support flex open. And this gives FlyQuest a lot of flexibility per se, because this gives them both aggressive and defensive Kalista combos. At this point, Hanwha cannot ban every single Kalista combo with what they've got, even if they pick one of them. So you could ban out Leona Poppy, as I say. There's still Nico, there's still Renata. You could still go Nautilus/Leona. You can go Alistair. You can go some crazy stuff, right? Even an Amumu flux to support is not necessarily off the table here. The reason for this is that FlyQuest just completely go off the rails here with the first Urgot pick as well of the entire tournament. I believe all 3 of these champions, with the exception of Cassio being played by FlyQuest previously, are things that basically no other team is willing to do. It's some psychopath shit for sure, and I'm really down for it. And to be honest with you, with this draft, I actually really like the concept because FlyQuest basically call out Hanwha entirely on their forward comp with 2 minor caveats. The only things that I personally think that FlyQuest could improve in order to make this essentially a draft checkmate are, 1, the Amumu pick either being too early or actually not having enough pressure around the map to supplement it, and 2, picking the caveat picks a little bit too early, in my opinion. There's not enough oomph on the map in order to basically give them enough cash out here. So their cash out is insane right now, right? Like if they have a really good early game, holy, this game is absolutely cooked. Like there's no way Hanwha can go in, right? But the problem is, like a team like Fly, they're just not given enough resources here in order to stabilize their early game. So there is a phase of the game in the early game where Hanwha can do whatever they want, and basically in the game, Hanwha does do whatever they want. This is the key weakness of the Amumu, right? They basically go ahead, run in his pockets, and then they just cause a lot of chaos in the early game, and this allows Hanwha to kind of circumvent the sort of comp advantage potentially that Fly would have, right? You just don't give them that chance. And I think, if the purpose of their comp isn't going to be as strong if they gain like a few thousand gold advantage in the early game, they gain like all the objectives, right? Your comp's obviously better with that context. So especially at a level like at like such something like Worlds. So that is something to keep in mind. And that was the only thing that I would really say like that was wrong with this draft. And I think it was honestly a really excellent idea. I think it's really innovative drafting overall. And I think I love this sort of idea from FlyQuest. The second game gets even crazier. This is what y'all came for, okay? This is actually where it actually goes off the rails. So Hanwha, look at their bans, right? They have to ban Ivor and Cassio because FlyQuest, they bring a dynamic to the draft that a lot of teams are not used to. And I really do think this is what drafting is about. You got to come out with your own flavor. You got to do things that will throw other teams off guard. How else are you going to get an advantage in draft, right? You got to get creative. There's the aspects of executing what's good well, and then there's also the aspect of coming up with unique solutions to enable your team to do well. And I think FlyQuest are really trying their best here to give themselves that sort of advantage. In this game, a little bit of an interesting different direction, whereas Hanwha go for a Renekton opener. Not many teams are willing to do this anymore, by the way, because it's such a risky champ. But this is LCK number 1, guys. This is a team that's really willing to, if there's any team that's down to do this, it is Hanwha. I would trust them with this sort of thing. And clearly, FlyQuest don't give a fuck, bro. Like, they go Kalista again. I'm still down for this sort of opener flex pick. It secures really strong matchups. I think I'm a fan. Kalista stonks, going up, baby. Notice the Ziggs also slipping through this as well. With Fly opening with a Kalista, they know that with Kalista Olaf, they know that Hanwha are not going to... Hanwha knows that Fly is not going to opt for it. They could have went for the Ziggs instead of the Ezreal here, but they chose to go Ezreal. This is most likely a stylistic choice, if anything, to be honest with you. It could be a better matchup, or they just choose to do so. They also try to cash out the Renekton with a Zyra. So this is part of their separate plan, I guess. And it's quite interesting, I'm going to be honest with you. But what is even more interesting is this Olaf into Renekton sort of matchup. I'm surprised FlyQuest picked it this early because I would say it's a relatively comp-defining pick, and it gives enough room for Hanwha to basically draft around it and create enough room. But FlyQuest got more in the cookbook. Let's just put it that way, yeah? So FlyQuest, they catch on, they ban some defensive things and other things that would basically make this draft go out of hand. And Hanwha just don't want anything to do with the circus. They are not down. And actually, the Amumu ban makes somewhat of sense here because of the Zyra pick that's already been revealed. If the Amumu matches the pacing with the Zyra, then it's going to be cooked. Because the Amumu can cash out really hard as well, and it can cause some problems. And this is where it just, all right, guys, it's like, if we're going to be NA, let's just draft like NA, right? This is the Nunu server, let's just run it. And on paper, it actually makes some sense. It may look absolutely nonsensical, and they are throwing away their Worlds ticket by doing something like this. But we are in a world where the jungle pool has actually been choked, and a lot of junglers, maybe the other junglers don't fit the bill for what they're looking for. A lot of the normal facilitator junglers are off the board. No one wants to play them, right? Jarvan, Lee Sin, they all look pretty homeless, right? Skarner doesn't look that great here because of the poke nature of Hanwha's comp. It doesn't feel appropriate. You could go Nocturne. It is possible, but you want more utility. So Inspired leans into a champ that gives himself availability to all his laners, especially to one such as Olaf that needs resources, as well as the Kalista lane. and he does so. So very unique pick. Hanwha, they start having fun a little bit. They go Yasuo Poppy. And now it's a little bit confusing as to the direction of their comp, if I were to have any feedback here. Flag actually catch onto this as well. And it's like let's call it a last minute adjustment in terms of picking the Hui on 5 and giving themselves an out in case like going forward is an issue, right? They pick Porfapaya on the 4-5. They kind of realize that if they force full forward, it might not work that well. So the Hui is a really good, well-rounded pick in order to round themselves out. And it actually really does help a lot, right? This is a Fiesta. They need something that's a low resource, able to handle well against the Yasuo, and basically round out the comp. And it ends up panning out quite well. And it could be on Hanwha a little disrespecting a little bit and getting a little bit confused by just how wacky this draft is, right? That's part of the dynamic and the benefit of picking stuff like this is if you're the coaching staff on Hanwha, you're probably genuinely confused as to what to pick. You'd probably take a longer time than normal to discuss like what the potential options were, and then this is what you come up with. It's certainly an interesting option. I'm sure they had their unique reasons for it, but to say this is the most optimal pick, or to say that they couldn't come up with something better within a longer time frame, we've got to acknowledge that one, right? So this is kudos on Fly, and that's how they managed to actually squeeze this out. This was a very bad start to this game, by the way. I actually do think Bwipo was out of the game at one point, but there was so much chaos that he forced himself back in. And this is just how they're used to playing. He gets blasted in lane a little bit, but they just make the game so chaotic, and the comp is just so like different. And like drafting is also to basically facilitate a playstyle for your team, and this is also that kind of draft for FlyQuest. So that is something to keep in mind as well. It's the same thing as GAM drafting around Levi. It's like T1 drafting around their support counter pick and putting more emphasis on that than normal, I would say, compared to other teams. You gotta really own your identity as a team, and this is like perfect example of that. It looks like a clown fest, but if that's your forte, you gotta own that. You know what I'm saying? Game 3. I would say it's a little bit unlucky on this one, because I think FlyQuest had such unique and interesting drafts for the first 2 games, and this one was a little bit of a toss in my honest opinion. So it starts off with a Skarner opener from Hanwha, basically a non-answer from a draft perspective, which is fine. But then FlyQuest goes straight for a Kai'Sa Vi. So these are 2 champs that are okay, let's say from a popularity perspective and presence perspective, but from a compositions perspective and giving yourselves the room to adapt just in case, I would say it's a little bit rough, right? You haven't necessarily identified your targets in this sort of composition, right? So when you go for something as specialized as Kai'Sa Vi and R1, R2, you actually increase the viability of specific counter picks like the Xayah that Han will actually go for here on the 2-3. And the reason why this has significance is because FlyQuest are a team that usually thrives off giving counterpick to Bwipo, and in this meta, I think most teams, a lot of the priority picks and a lot of the, let's say, draft resources are given away from top lane. Top laners do not take them at this moment, because a lot of the best top laners are basically blind pick top laners, and this creates as much leverage as possible for the rest of the lanes, right? I'm not saying Bwipo's counter picks are bad. That's not what I'm trying to say at all. I think they are excellent. It's just that we are in a meta where the cash out from top lane counter picks is probably not as hefty as getting counter picks in some of the other comp defining roles at the moment, right? Let's say jungle, as an example. Vi and Nocturne are very comp defining champions. So if you hold jungle back even 1 or 2 slots, it could create a completely different composition for you. Or AD carry even a little bit, right? As you see here, it creates completely different dynamics based on what laner you pick, what pressure you have. A lot of options here. If you go for Ziggs, it changes your win con entirely. Kai'Sa is completely different as well. There's a lot of different dynamics that are created from this. It doesn't even matter that the Xayah Rakan is broken up, because most of the value that Hanwha has gotten from the Xayah already exceeds what Hanwha is looking for, right? So at this point, it's pretty clear that FlyQuest's comp is pretty much forward, except with the exception of the Casio, right? That's where I get a little bit even more confused with this comp, because now it's just on Hanwha to play a composition that can create more space than what FlyQuest is willing to offer and play around their ranges, and then it's just pretty easy to pilot at that point. That's why they go for Xayah Poppy. That's why they go for the Gnar, because they can play really front to back and they can just chill, right? They don't have to be pressed against something like the FlyQuest comp here, because the range it has is actually relatively limited. At some point, the way they fight team fights, it has to go in. They can't create space in any other way by threatening individual targets, with the exception of Vi, but it's really hard for them, and there's no good target for this Vi. There's no good target. You can't really play front to back with this kind of comp too. And even though they're trying to, I won't even mention the Scion on 5 into the Gnar, which is like a self counter almost. So in this case, you can kind of see why it's like kind of rough for the FlyQuest comp on 3. This is obviously the weakest draft out of the bunch for them, and I don't want to cause like a detriment or detract from the other 2 drafts, but basically, overall, extremely strong showing, I would say, against the number 1 Korean seed, like someone who's basically slated to take the whole thing, right? Versus our silly little North American team. Now, there is so much good that's happening out of this draft, and I look forward to seeing FlyQuest on their last life here and how they, on their last life here, and seeing how they continue to adapt, right? So hopefully this gave some insight into the little draft dynamics. This is a little bit longer than normal, but there's a lot to break down in this draft, and I think it was lovely to basically go through. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys. I'll see you in the next one.